Now, some work which my colleagues have done for me suggests that for as long as Nigeria's reserves are north, in other words, in excess of $35 billion gross 90-day moving average reserves, the central bank should be fine. That the central bank should be fine. So if you're looking for a threshold beyond or below which trouble starts, or trouble could, don't let me say below which trouble will start, below which trouble could start, it's to see that reserves don't drop below about $35 billion. And this is not a figure plucked out of the air. For those of you who are economists or who are interested in the empirics of economics, there's something called the threshold methodology, and that's what was applied, and that's the figure that you've got now. So that's the first thing, that at least you have a threshold. And I think relative to that threshold, we've still got quite a headroom, as analysts would say. Okay, so that's the first thing. The second part of the question is then, what are we supposed to keep our eyes peeled for, which may point to reserve challenges? I think there are a couple of things. Number one, oil prices, of course. You must keep your eyes peeled for oil prices. Number two, you must keep your eyes peeled for oil production. Those two are probably the key indicators to look out for. Number three, that you might keep your eyes also, looking out for, is whether the list of items that you cannot import changes significantly. Remember, I made the point about us having a preference for a strong currency. And therefore, we've always been very clear that, look, if push comes to shove, there are a number of things you do. The first, you limit access to currency, and you do it. You cannot influence, since you can't influence the supply side, which is about, putting more supply, then you work with the demand side. And the demand side means you really work with two groups of people. First of all, you hold the banks, and you hold the reserves, because as I'm sure you all know, Nigerian as global banking is about fractional banking, is about reserve banking. And so if you hold the reserves of banks, in other words, the amounts of monies that banks deposit with the central bank, then of course you limit the ability of banks to, shall we say, do business that may threaten or raise the demand for foreign currency. In the last couple of years, we've seen that, happen. Cash reserve ratios of banks have risen. Effectively, some banks say, I haven't looked at this, but effectively some banks tell you that their cash reserve ratios are as high as 40%. So that's number one. So on the banking side, you pretty much hold the banks back. The second thing that you could look out for is on the demand side of access. Guidelines and regulations kind of get to change that make it more difficult to access FX. So as you see those happening, then they may be preemptive, but usually Nigeria doesn't like to preempt anything. We usually like to wait, and then when matter scatters, then we start doing whatever we can. Simply because we're very hopeful people, and we typically tend to think that, okay, when the matter reaches, then we'll see what we're going to do about it. It's not a matter of central bank or anybody in particular. That's just the way I see that we have run some of these things. So for me, a couple of things. One, there's a threshold of about $35 billion below which we think the central bank may have to start thinking what are its options. Second is that you must, on the supply side would be for some of us, the ideal would be the supply side. Increase the supply, incentivize more people to bring in currency that can then be traded in the markets. But in the absence of that, you manage the demand side. And the demand side is about two main things. First, you hold the ability of banks to create businesses that, or engage in transactions that potentially could harm the currency. And secondly, you also restrict access to FX. So those are the things that I would actually just look out for.